Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. I'm so glad you could join us. It should be a very fun event. We've got some great authors with some great new historical fiction. My name is Colin Mustful. I am the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, an independent press that publishes historical novels. Just a few quick things for you. Please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from. It'd be great to get to know who's here. The event will include, I will facilitate conversation with these authors, talk to them about their books, but there will be a Q&A towards the end, and we're just going to do that in the chat. So if you have questions for our authors, just hang on to those for a little bit, and then I'll announce when we're going to do that with about 15 minutes left in the event. And also, I want to let you know about their books and that they're available for purchase at bookshop.org. I put together a landing page and I just posted that in the chat. So you can find all of our panelists' books on that landing page, and it shows a description. And if you want to purchase those books, it'll send you to bookshop.org, which is an organization that sells books and then gives percentages of the sales back to local booksellers. And so we want to support local booksellers by selling our books through bookshop.org. So once again, thanks so much for joining us. It should be a really fun event. I'm going to leave the screen here so that it's just our four panelists. Emily Bleeker, if you could say hello and let us know a little bit about your book.
Sure. Hi, I'm Emily. This is my seventh novel, When We Were Enemies. It is a half historical, half contemporary, but the historical element is from the summer of 1943 when we were still enemies with Italy. So it is about POW camps here in the US and some shenanigans involved there as well. So that's what we're discussing today, I guess.
Thanks, Emily. Katherine Vaz, if you could say hello and let us know a little bit about your book.
Yes, hi. Here I have the cover with me, which I think you can see in the chat. My name is Katherine Vaz, and I live in New York City. And hello from Manhattan. My sixth book is a novel that involves a very curious immigration story from people who were violently driven off the island of Madeira, a Portuguese island, and adopted by Springfield and Jacksonville, Illinois at the time of Lincoln. So it's a historical romance, Civil War novel, immigration story. And there's a lot more to talk about it, but I'll conclude there for now.
Thanks. Yeah, I look forward to talking to more about your novel. Catherine Howe, if you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Hello there. I'm Katherine Howe, and I'm here talking about A True Account, Hannah Masuri's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself, which is a little bit of Gone Girl meets Treasure Island. It opens in Boston in 1726 with a girl named Hannah Masuri who has been bound out to service in a waterfront cafe since she was a tiny, tiny child. And she ends up witnessing a real life pirate hanging that really did happen in Boston in 1726 of a guy named William Fly. And Hannah gets caught up in some intrigue and has to disguise herself and flee on what she thinks is a fruit packet bound for the Azores. But it turns out that she's delivered herself into the hands of pirates who were Confederates of William Fly. And then about 40 pages in, we realize as we are hearing Hannah's story that we've actually been reading over the shoulder of someone. Her name's Marion Beresford. She's a professor at Radcliffe in 1929, and her undergraduate has discovered a manuscript called A True Account, Hannah Masuri's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself. And it contains a mystery that Marion wants to solve.
Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine. And finally, Sean, if you could say hello and let us know about your book.
Well, hello from sunny Brisbane. It's great to listen to those introductions. It just reminds you that historical fiction can take you anywhere, anytime, any place. So my book is The Second Sight of Zachary Cloudesley. And he says, dropping it. And it's at its heart, it's a father-son love story. It opens in 1750 in Leadenhall Street, London. And Abel tries to raise Zachary, whose mother dies sadly in childbirth. he doesn't believe himself to be a very good father. And in the background is Aunt Frances, who is a proto-feminist and an astronomer, and who has very firm ideas about how to raise a child. And so quite a lot of the novel is the tussle between Aunt Frances and Abel. Abel is a clockmaker, and he also makes these incredible automata, these mechanical machines that were so amazing in the latter half of the 18th century. And he's inveigled into going to Constantinople in Turkey. And young Zachary is told that Abel, his father, he won't ever see him again. And so the rest of the novel is really Zachary's search for what's happened to his father.
That sounds really interesting, and the title alone makes me just brings up so many questions about it. Well, let's go back to Emily. Emily, if you could talk about the main characters in your novel, Elsie and Vivian, and how you use a contemporary character in order to share a historical setting and event.
Sure. So Elise is actually the second generation, or actually the third generation of a family full of fame. So that is the modern day timeline. She is the back in time timeline is Vivian Snow, who was Vivian Santini in 1943, and it's her pre-fame story. So what I love about it is that we know in the present day timeline that Vivian Santini goes on to be this mega superstar, Vivian Snow, but Vivian Santini does not know that. So that's kind of a fun privilege that we have as readers. And then Elise is not interested in being famous. Her grandmother is famous, her mother is famous, her brothers are famous, but she wants to step out of the spotlight. But there is a documentary being made about her grandmother's early life, and she has been convinced by her family to get married in the chapel where her grandmother was married in the small town in Indiana where her grandmother grew up. So that's where she comes from.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a family generational story.
It is. It's a generational story. It's the, it's this mystery of it's what we all wonder. A lot of historical fiction that tickles my mind usually comes from an inspiration from a family story. My father made this comment years and years ago where he was like, "Oh, your grandmother worked in a POW camp and fell in love with an Italian priest there." And I was like, that's a lot of things I didn't know were going to come out of your mouth right now. And because I didn't understand that there were POW camps in the US, that my grandmother worked in one, or that you should even fall in love with an Italian priest. But that just got my mind going, and I didn't even consider myself a writer at that time. But the story stuck with me and I wanted to know more. So that's kind of what happens with Elise too, is she's like, I want to know more. I want to know more about this story about my grandmother, what really happened, and some things that didn't line up with the story that she'd been told her whole life.
That's great. Well, Katherine Vaz, you have a bit of family history in yours, don't you? Can you talk about your main characters, John and Mary, and what they go through?
Sure. It's, I guess, under the category of sweeping saga. It did take me over 15 years to write this book. And the genesis, I suppose, was when I write a lot about the Portuguese in America. My father was an immigrant from the Azores, and I grew up in California myself, but I still have a lot of relatives in the Azores, and work in Portugal a lot and love it there. Anyway, I was at the Library of Congress giving a talk, and in the Hispanic division, and the woman there said, you should see this exhibit in the map room. And it was something called the Portuguese Protestants of Illinois, which I thought was very funny. And so I started investigating the story a little bit. And there was a newspaper interview. My novel is fiction, of course, but it's based on the true story of this group of people who were violently driven off the island because they had been converted to Presbyterianism, and they were actually adopted by the people in Illinois. And a lot of them worked around the Lincoln household. So I had this character who reported in this newspaper interview as an old man going back to the Lincoln household in, I think, 1919, and his hand trembling so much he couldn't sign the guest book because he was remembering falling in love with and courting a girl named Mary there. So that blank about that trembling hand and him going off to the Civil War, coming back, and then wandering the West for 50 years before he found her, is that blank, like what happened, was where the novel grew. So it was based on, John Alves was raised in jail with his mother in Madeira, and so a lot of that took root in me. The character of Mary is very largely based, I suppose, on my own father, who was an immigrant, but also school teacher and wonderful gardener. So there's a lot of that in the book. And so Mary is the character that bloomed. And some of my own stories are mixed in there. For example, in the Azores, the nickname for my family was the Little Birds, Os Passarinhos. And so the beginning of the book, I combined that with John in jail with his mother, because that branch of my family were so hungry, they would sing to eat their music to distract themselves when they were hungry. So they were called the Little Birds because they would sing when they were hungry. So that's a story in my family that I knit into the novel as a whole. So then it was following, lots of research, but we'll talk more about the research, I think, in the next round of questions.
Yeah, it definitely covers a lot of history. And just for my own personal benefit, because I planned a trip to the Azores in 2021, but then there's a COVID uptick.
Yeah.
Should I make sure to get there?
Yes. It
Don't
is.
take a fruit packet.
Don't take a packet, but it's, get in touch with me, because I know tons of people there. I have family there, and San Miguel is the big island, and people go to Furnish and all sorts of places, but there are all sorts of other islands you should see too. And it is a magical place. It's a lovely, beautiful place. And, the history is not without its pain, though. And I think that's important to recall. It's a place of real feeling.
Sure. Well, Katherine Howe, you have, much like Emily, you have a dual timeline. Yours, I think, is 1930, and then much earlier, 1700s. But talk about the two characters between Hannah and Marion, a little bit more about who they are and how they're connected.
Yeah, Hannah is, as I say, she is a working person who's in her late teens. We never really learn exactly how old she is. And she is part of a kind of a longstanding tradition of stories about women who disguise themselves as men and go pirating. There are some famous examples. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are probably the two most famous examples, who were both in disguise in the crew of a guy named Calico Jack Rackham in 1716. And they were captured eventually, and everyone was set to hang. And this is all true, by the way. They were all set to hang. And Anne and Mary both pleaded their bellies, which is to say that they were pregnant. And so they got to have their death sentences commuted for a time until they were delivered. And reportedly, Calico Jack was brought to Anne. Anne was his lover, was brought to Anne in prison and was bemoaning his fate. And Anne supposedly said that she was sorry to see it, but if he'd fought like a man, he wouldn't have had to die like a dog. So there are a couple of kind of famous stories of women who disguised themselves as men and went pirating, and a few other famous fictional examples. And so Hannah is kind of my take on this trope. Like, one of the things that a true account is playing with is engaging with some of the narrative tropes that we all associate with piracy and stories of piracy, and giving them an actual historically accurate cant. Which is something that I like to do in my fiction a lot. And usually I like to have the more remote, I write a lot in the early modern American colonies period. And so usually I find myself liking to have a character who acts as like the interpreter of what's going on in the past. So I write a lot about academics and graduate students and things like that. And in this instance, Marion is a professor who she's obviously from a much more privileged background than Hannah is, but in Hannah, she starts to see the promise of what can happen when you dare to make a different choice in your life. And in both of the timelines, So one of the central organizing questions of the plot is Hannah real? Does she exist? Which is a kind of an open question about a lot of historical pirate figures. And Marion, in the course of yearning to prove that Hannah was real, is also exploring ways to be more authentic to herself. And so the book engages a lot with questions of the ways that we all try to appear as people expect us to be in order to secure our safety or our freedom to move. And so there's a lot in A True Account about identity and about safety and about gender and the ways that those things are all interconnected.
Yeah, so was Hannah, she took the role of a cabin boy, is that right?
She takes the role, yeah, she takes the role of a cabin boy. And there's actually a whole discussion that happens in A True Account between Marion and her student, wondering how Hannah's body would have read if she was dressed in boys' clothes, and theorizing that if she had been working her whole life and starving and malnourished, that she would have looked like a pre-adolescent boy, arguably. And so there's a whole kind of discussion over the feasibility of this disguise that takes place in the story as well.
That's fascinating. Oh, well, Sean, let's go next to you. You have your novel, The Second Sight of Zachary Cloudesley. I'm really curious to know about the setting of your novel and some of the themes. And it looks kind of like a bit of a historical fantasy. Would you call it that? And how would you define its genre?
So thanks very much, Colin. Yeah, I think although I would say it's historical fiction, going into bookshops, it's been out in the UK for a year or so, and going into bookshops, sometimes they'd say, "Oh yeah, we put it in fantasy, or we've put it in coming of age." But fortunately, our main chain, Waterstones, have sort of picked it as a book of the year, so it's out on tables at the front now. So that's a relief. You don't have to worry about the categorizing. It was really, really interesting, actually, to just listen to Katherine talking about, women living as men, because actually one of the themes in the novel, for those people that read it, is there is a man who we would these days call a trans man. And I think this is something that people think, didn't happen in the past, but of course it happened a lot. And particularly women who lived as men and in some cases were, regarded themselves as men. And they were not just pirates, but of course quite a lot of people who were born as women who ended up going to war, being in the Navy and so on. And there's some fascinating stories there. So that was one of the things. But the principal theme, I think, in the novel, I was inspired by a clock I saw in Istanbul, and that sort of unlocked a whole lot of things about clockwork and why there was this trade with the Ottoman Empire, playing with time and why the interest in time. And in fact, there were big shifts in concepts of time and the standardization of time, which actually made for a terrible sort of first draft, because it's very hard to sort of write about time in a conceptual way. And then I realized we needed this child, and if his father was a clockmaker, that would allow me to play much more with time and the creation of these incredible clockwork machines. I've just been to Switzerland to see some of the originals that were inspirations for the automata, the clockwork machines in Zachary. And I suppose that's what then led me into this whole tussle between magic and reason. And the next novel that's coming out next summer, and indeed the one about after that, are all going to be playing with this battle almost that I think occupied quite a large part of 18th century thinking, between the sort of celebration of reason and rationality, but you were only really a few decades from when people were still believing in witchcraft. And so it's very interesting how science still sometimes seems to have the almost ghostly traces of magic around it, which was also the case with these clockwork automata, and I think lead in an interesting way to the story of Frankenstein, and beyond that to some of the other kind of almost horror tropes of the 19th century.
Do you see any correlations or connections between the research you did there about automation and where we are today with this new age of AI?
Oh, absolutely. So I was just invited to Geneva actually to give a talk on that subject of, is 18th century, is modern day AI the child of 18th century clockwork, which initially seems a kind of absurd argument, because although the clockwork that was being developed in the 18th century was in many ways the forerunner of computers, and you can trace through the sophistication of there was a Swiss clockmaker called Jacques Dreux who created a writing boy. I mean, some of these I've kind of ripped off, as it were, for the novel. A writing boy, a girl that played the piano, and they were programmed like computers. Then you've got Charles Babbage, the difference machine, which was a computer in the 1830s that could do very complex calculations, through to Deep Blue, the first computer that could beat a human at chess, and chess is a theme in the novel. But actually, I think the line that leads through there to AI is, in a sense, less interesting than the line that leads from magic, because what we are, in a way, we're incredibly excited and incredibly terrified about AI. We don't know what it can do, but what it can or will do is what our imaginations allow it to do fundamentally. And people's imaginations in the 18th century truly believed, I think, that we would reach this point where we would have, they called them androids, not robots, but android was a word used in the 18th. There would be androids that would be capable of breathing and moving. That was partly the objective of creating these automata. But in my novel, I have a character called the Earl of Derby, but it's inspired by a creature called the Mechanical Turk. And the Mechanical Turk played chess against Benjamin Franklin. It played chess against the Emperor Napoleon. And everyone believed it was an automaton that could play and beat these people and others at chess. They believed that, even though in fact it was a fraud. And just to finish the point, I think Amazon uses humans at the moment, and they call those humans the Mechanical Turk, to do things like the humanity tests you have to do in signing in. So they employ humans where it's quite cheap to employ people to pretend to be computers, pretending to be people. So there's a whole lot of stuff to explore there.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's go back to Emily. You write about an Italian POW camp in Indiana. Is that right? When doing research on World War II, we don't hear much about what happened here at home, at least home for those in the U.S. Can you talk more about the POW camps that were here and some of the research that, some of the things you uncovered in your research?
Yes, I write about Camp Atterbury, but there were thousands of POW camps in the US, and there are hundreds and thousands of Italian and German POWs in the US. Now, after Italy switched sides, all of the Italian soldiers, 90% of them, actually switched also and became part of Italian service units. And then the other 10% went to like this high security prison in Texas. But you can find stories of almost every state where there were these camps. And the camps were very interesting because they were just run like little towns, and they were run by the POWs. So there were guards there, but the whole communities, all of the voting that happened, all of the rules and regulations were actually run by the prisoners. And for the majority of the time, they were allowed to wear their uniforms. They still respected each other in the same ranks that they would have had in the army. And interestingly, the US, as kind of a propaganda campaign, really followed the Geneva Conventions very closely, like all of the rules that they all agreed upon, because they wanted soldiers to want to surrender when they would be in battle. They wanted them to say, hey, we'll give up. We'd rather come and be in this place where we're treated nicely and then keep fighting. And it actually worked. That's actually one of the reasons that Italy, there were soldiers who surrendered so easily. Like, they were actually shocked at how easily the Italian soldiers, they were like, we're done. We don't want to do this anymore. So that was a really fascinating thing for me. I didn't understand that. Part of the book is also about the building of a chapel at Camp Atterbury. It's called the Chapel in the Meadow. And you will find these POW chapels all over the US. There's actually also one in Scotland that were built by the POWs, because part of the agreements from the Geneva Convention was that the prisoners could absolutely have their own religious practices. And one of those things, especially for the Italian prisoners, was to have a chapel where they could worship. And so they built this chapel that still stands at Camp Atterbury out of just scrap materials. They were given permission to do this. They had a whole team. They had masons there. They had artists there. So it was very interesting to go and visit that and to actually see the handiwork of these POWs.
Yeah, and I never even considered visiting a historical site related to the POW camps.
Yeah, they say they have a whole museum there. So you can really see what life was like. Camp Atterbury is still there. The town is still there. And you can go to the chapel. They even have the POW cemetery there as well. So I found that it was just such a trip back in time just to go there. And I'm glad they preserved that. I guess that it fell into disrepair after the war, but that they went back and they restored as much as they could so that that piece of history could be preserved.
Someone's asking where that is. Is Orkney a city in Indiana? I'm not sure.
No, I'm pretty sure Orkney is where it is. Yes.
Okay.
The Scottish chapel. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's known as the Italian Chapel, and in fact, a friend called Philip Parrish has written a novel called The Italian Chapel, absolutely about that story. Yeah, and Italian POWs who stayed in Scotland are quite a significant population. There's a lot of Italians in Glasgow, and I think quite a lot of them came as POWs. So it's an amazing connection.
Yes, and a lot of people did stay. Like you couldn't send the POWs back to a war-torn country. That was also something that was agreed upon in the Geneva Convention. So they stayed, worked for the Italian service unit. Some were repatriated, but some were actually able to stay in the US. And especially there were a lot of romances that happened with the Italian soldiers and American women. And so there are a lot of families that started that way.
Wow. Let's go back to Katherine Vaz. You had mentioned you spent 15 years working on your novel Above the Salt, and it's a historical saga that covers so many different places and time periods. Talk about the research you did and how you were able to kind of condense that into a narrative.
Sure. Well, in some ways, my philosophy of research is a good one, I think, for life in general, which is not to sit at a computer and look up facts so much as going to places and being surprised by people, not just looking things up. Because I started, it's really more like 18 years ago. That was when we were still toting around yellow legal pads to take notes. And it's just, it was kind of a love story about my love story, because I was a little hesitant at first, but I went to Madeira and managed to faint in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library, while I was doing some research because it was so humid. So I thought, oh, great, my love story is starting with me swooning. But believe it or not, I found a lot of documentation. In fact, it was in English, that were things that they had collected there from sources in Illinois. So in a way, it was like, oh gosh. And the people who sort of helped me to my feet after I fainted said, what are you looking for? And they helped me on my path. But I had all these kind of really bizarre things happen with my research. There was a teaching fellowship that opened up at Illinois College in Jacksonville. And what are the odds of that? They were so surprised someone was writing about Jacksonville, Illinois, that I got the gig. And I, fun things like going to the Lincoln, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And they were so thrilled that I wasn't there for genealogy to find out if my uncle had been the third pallbearer for Lincoln, whatever, that they said, let's go into the vault and get things out. And so we pulled up Mary Todd Lincoln's cookbook. We got the Lincoln Ledger, where the character I was tracing and following said his hand shook so much someone else signed the book for him, and it was verbatim the way he described it. And that's kind of when I fell for him. Now, one tiny little interesting thing that happened in my research was I came across, you can write to the Veterans Administration, they'll send you anything you ask for. And I got his documents, and apparently he was court-martialed for 20 days. And I was at the Radcliffe Institute at the time when Drew Faust was there, and she happens to be a Civil War expert. I said, what did he do? Because, I mean, it was fiction, but I also wanted to, find out what he really did. And she said, ooh, I don't know, but I'll put you in touch with someone where you can go to the national, the old military records in Washington, D.C. Now, I walked in there, and what are the odds that I walk in when the historian who's won 2 Pulitzer, Alan Taylor, is there, which makes more sense for him to be there than for Katherine Vaz to be there. But he said, Katherine, and I said, Alan. And I said, I'm trying to find out what my guy might have done in the war. And he said what everyone said, the people in charge of the archives, Drew Faust and Alan Taylor, he said, it's a needle in a haystack. So I gave a talk about this recently about research, and I said, I put the actual crime he committed in the book, in the novel, but let me tell you something, you will fall in love with him. I thought, oh my God, I'm so glad that he was court-martialed for this. So I'll let people discover that in the book because it's fun to find out. But I had so much fun in Illinois. For example, there was a botanist there named Dr. Lawrence Settler who was developing ghost orchid perfume. Now, how would I have guessed or done any research sitting on my computer that there were actual ghost orchids growing on the prairie of Illinois? So that makes a cameo in my book too. I had this kind of delightful sense of seeing what happens. And then, of course, as my fellow authors can all verify here, the process of leaving most of it out and honing the story and making only what was of good use came into play. But I couldn't help myself. The ghost orchid perfume is in there, and the crime my guy committed that got him court-martialed is in there, and I guarantee you'll love him for it. And Mary was more mysterious because he mentioned her by name, but women are harder to trace because their names change when they get married and so forth. And she came to life for me in a very different way, I think more fictionalized way that made sense, but it also fit into the timeline that he was creating. So I think I just gave myself over to seeing what gets discovered. There's a wonderful line by, I think, James Joyce, that if you're in the stream of things and you're receptive, a piece of paper with the word you're seeking will blow up to you while you're standing on the street corner. I mean, Emily Dickinson has a wonderful phrase about keeping the soul ajar. And I think that that's a really great attitude about research.
And I like that you brought in some of the people that were there along the way to kind of help you, because as writers, as researchers, you're doing so much work by yourself. But it's a good reminder that all of you, I'm sure, have had helpers and experts and people to point you in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. There were just people who were, I'm still friends with Dr. Lawrence Settler, friends with the woman in the Hispanic division, Dr. Aida Chiquera Wiarda, who first gave me the story. And there was still a part of Jacksonville called Madera Hill, which a lot of people don't know about. It's really one of the most fascinating immigration stories that is so little known. But I mean, there are all sorts of political reasons that they were abolitionists. So, of course, the party of Lincoln wanted them there. But it was also a sign and a symbol of great American generosity, because they were simply in dire need and they were just brought in and helped. And a lot of them were laborers. They worked hard, but it was a real, and to me, that was something I wanted to cling to in the book and give it a sense of connecting to the present day, of that the American soul was that generous.
I'm seeing some questions in the chat, and I'm going to get to those in about 10 minutes. So if any of our attendees have some questions, start thinking about those. I also want to repost the link to the landing page with our panelists' books in case you've kind of decided which one of these you want. Maybe you want them all. Just head to that landing page. Katherine Howe, I am curious to know more about the golden age of piracy, about this hanging that kind of starts off your novel. And was it, well, what did you learn about the golden age of piracy? Is that a misnomer? Why is it called that?
I think it's called that because that's when so many of the pirates that we know from popular culture were active. But one thing that I found interesting in researching the golden age of piracy, so the amount of research that I did for a true account is actually going to be apparent in April when I release a primary source reader with Penguin Classics called The Penguin Book of Pirates. So there's ample pirate reading going to be available if you need it. But one thing that I found fascinating to think about is one of the reasons we're so romantic about pirates, I think, is for two reasons. One, because we don't actually know that much about them. And two, because they represent this fantasy of freedom, a fantasy of a merry life and a short one, as Bartholomew Roberts put it. And there are some historians who've argued that the kind of internal logic and organization of a pirate ship in the 1600s and into the beginning of the 1700s was really the first form of what we would now recognize as democracy. Because the captain of a pirate crew was elected by popular acclaim, and that could be taken away. People signed their names or put their marks to an agreement of what they owed to each other and how the spoils would be divided. There's also, so talking about the hanging of William Fly, there's a historian named Marcus Rediker who's written a lot about Golden Age piracy, and he has very persuasively argued that piracy is very much about a rhetoric of terror. That it is about, on the one hand, the pirates themselves forming a terrifying enough threat that often as not, they could actually take a ship without hurting anyone because everyone was so afraid that they would be hurt. And of course, insurance companies backed all the cargoes of these merchant marine ships. And so the mariners who are working on these ships have no vested interest in protecting the cargo with their lives. So there was a strong incentive, especially as pirates did what they could to make themselves more terrifying, like Blackbeard having a long beard and lighting matches in his hat and things like that. But on the other hand, it was in the state's interest at that time to terrify mariners out of piracy, to terrify them out of temptation to mutiny at a time when working on the ocean was actually very brutal work. And so one of the ways they did that was through these sorts of spectacle punishments. So William Fly was a real guy. He was subject to hard usage, as he testified at his trial. And he and some friends took over their ship where they were working, called the Elizabeth, and changed its name to Fame's Revenge. And they went pirating off of the Carolinas. They needed a guy who would help them find directions. And so they kidnapped a fisherman, and the fisherman tricked them, and they were captured outside of Boston. And then they were tried, and the redemption of their souls was overseen by the same guy, Cotton Mather, who oversaw the Salem witch trials 30 years before. So what the state did was not only did they publicly execute William Fly and his Confederates, which was not all that unusual at that time. People would travel from towns all over the place, just as they did at the Salem witch trials, to watch people hang. But after William Fly was hanged, and before he was hanged, he actually did a pretty remarkable thing. He mounted the scaffolding, and because he was a sailor, he looked at the noose and he said to the hangman, "Don't you know your trade?" And he retied the noose better and then put it around his own neck, which was pretty awesome. So the state, after William Fly was dead, his body was gibbeted. And that means that his body was hung up in chains and left to rot in a public place. And in this instance, the public place was a rock in the Boston Harbor Islands called Nix's Mate. Calico Jack Rackham, I mentioned earlier today, was also gibbeted. He was hung on an island outside of Port Royal, Jamaica, which is now called Rackham's Cay. And so his body would be left there so that any mariner coming into or out of Boston Harbor for as long as he lasted would see this grotesque spectacle of what the state was willing to do to you if you dared to mutiny, if you dared to disobey. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, the promise of freedom and the sense of piracy as a moment of claiming radical freedom. And also inevitably, because of the time period in which it was happening, in the arena in which it was happening, of colliding with the most radical case of unfreedom, which was the transatlantic slave trade. And I think I'm getting kind of into the weeds, and so I'll stop.
Oh, that's all very incredible history. And I got to admit, I love the name of the ship, Fame's Revenge. Did you
Isn't that
consider
great?
using that?
I know. I should have. I in the pirate ship in A True Account, it goes from being called the Reporter to being called the Fancy, which is also a pretty good piratey sort of name. That's
Yeah.
why in Treasure Island at the very beginning, the captain, who is the guy who introduces the song 15 Men on a Dead Man's Chest, we learn his name from a tattoo on his arm that says Billy Bones, his fancy.
Well, it's definitely ripe for stories and storytelling, and I can see how it's lived on that way in pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, your book is titled "The Second Sight." So, tell us about what that is for your character Zachary, and I want to know, really from a craft perspective, how did you use his ability to use his second sight in order to kind of deepen his character and create that emotional connection between that main character and the reader?
Yeah, I think he I wanted the child to be a special child, but I also was quite keen that it was others, his father, his wet nurse Grace Morley, who's a really important character in the book, others around him who kind of almost place their own desires to believe in the specialness of Zachary, rather than necessarily anything that you can determine is a particular kind of magical quality that he has. So I think the second sight sort of comes and goes through the book, and people, so at first it's something that's almost imposed on him as a young child. He's a very special child. Does he actually see the truth? So in a sense, there's a sense of a child's innocence exposing some of the lack of innocence that's around him. And of course, he's not always told the truth. So the reader has hopefully the pleasure of seeing the truth and seeing that Zachary, as an infant, almost is able to expose some of the untruths that are happening around him. So that's kind of one of the second sights. But then there's also the second sight in the sense that Zachary gets a second chance to sort of see, and the whole novel is built around this sense that that Zachary believes he isn't truly loved by his father, and yet I think the reader can hopefully see that he is, almost throughout the book. And of course that Zachary's father, Abel, believes he's a terrible father, and yet again I think the reader can see that he isn't. He's doing his best, and circumstances kind of get the better of him. And then there is a period a little bit towards the middle of the novel when Zachary's what we'd call these days a teenager, and he sets off across Europe and has a number of adventures across mid-18th century Europe, and of course fortune telling and conjuring and all these things was such a were really interesting part of 18th century life, and he meets somebody who tells him that he can use the skills. So he's almost given tips to sort of make his ability apparently to see into people's souls and apparently to see the future. And you're never quite certain as the reader whether he can or not. But I mean, he's taught how to do that rather better by a man, a renegade kind of Jacobite who turns out not to be such a good friend after all. But I won't say too much about that. So there's sort of hints and tips throughout of that magic.
Well, I think that's a really great way to just deepen the character and bring out more than you could just through what we see and what we hear. So we are getting some questions from the audience, so I'm going to go through some of those. So anyone who's attending, if you do have a question for one of our panelists, go ahead and post those in the chat. I'm going to go back to what Sandra asked here, and I'm just going to read her the text here. She says, I'm working on a novel about Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, the founder of modern Chicago. There is so very little available in the archives, much of it erroneous. It resolved that I have to invent much of his life. How comfortable do you feel fictionalizing the lives of historical figures? And Emily, since you are in Chicago, maybe you could give your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I am all for it. I think as long as you're clear that it's not an absolute historical recollection of it, I think it's fine. My next novel is actually tell the rest of Vivian Snow's life, her fame story. So the chunk we skip, and she runs into plenty of true historical figures and stars, and there are things that I think that I follow very closely, and then there are other bits that are obviously going to be fictionalized. So I think doing as much of your research as you can is important, but also we're writing fictionalized works of fiction. I don't know what everybody else thinks. I would love to hear your thoughts.
I think I have a slightly different perspective from Emily's, but that's also because I came to fiction writing from training as a historian. So I tend to get more comfortable, or else I've just like read too much Esther Forbes when I was a kid, because I've discovered that I am most comfortable having a fictional person who is the kind of person who would have existed at a certain moment in time, and oftentimes the kind of person who would not really leave a record of themselves in the archive. I feel more comfortable having that person interact with real people than I do inhabiting the perspective of someone who was a real person about which very little is known. Although I've done that before. I did that in my very first novel, The Physic Book of Deliverance Stain, as well. But I share Emily's feeling that the best thing to do is to really steep yourself in the research and in the sources, just to really, really know your stuff. And the more you know this person and the contours of their life, to the extent that you're able to reconstruct it, the more confident you can be in what you ascribe to their character.
I have to say I've never jumped into writing from a historical figure's like point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really definitely they're in the periphery. So
I would toss in also. I think that I agree with Katherine that that having people in the time and place when you're steeped in that, and having maybe that historical figure as someone they refer to, is a way of getting around that problem. But also to ask yourself what's drawing you to this story. What is it about this figure that is so compelling to you, and that you can use that to figure out what your story is supposed to be about in terms of its center. So it may not be the story of this person. Is what is the thing that's they feel passionate about in terms of what's drawn you to this.
I think Sandra's question is such an important one. I went to a conference actually not so long ago where it was a mixture of historians and historical fiction writers talking about just this issue. And the historians were saying, in a sense, we love the gaps as historians because that's what we have to fill, but we can only fill it with evidence. So we're having to go and try and find evidence and have that our contentions about those historical gaps filled with evidence. Whereas as fiction writers, of course, we can fill that evidence with what we imagine. And one place we can go as fiction writers that an historian really can't go is with that sort of free and direct speech. We're in this person's imagination. We're kind of we're imagining what it is that's their motivation. And the next novel I'm writing, which is published next year, is about an incredible 18th century figure called Mary Wortley Montagu, who should be hugely famous and has largely been forgotten, I think, because many, many interesting historical female figures have tended to get written out of history by men subsequently. I'm lucky enough to be in contact with the sort of greatest living biographer of Mary, Professor Isabel Grundy, who's in Canada, Edmonton, Canada, and kind of bouncing ideas off, saying, could Mary have done this? Because there's although we have a lot of Mary's letters and there's a lot of research, and I've had the joy of going and discovering research that I don't think has been catalogued, and seeing her letters and having them in my hand. Her diaries were burnt by her daughter because she thought they were so scandalous. So that, of course, gives me lots of scope to imagine what on earth it was that was driving this historical figure. But I think with historical figures, you know, the published facts, it's very you feel in a sense almost constrained to stick to sort of births, marriages, deaths, and dates of illnesses and things like that, because if you begin to break those rules, you're maybe going too far. But you should be able to use your imagination to what it is that's motivating your real historical character.
I think if you look at The Crown, it's done. I personally enjoy, like, or there's a book, Strangers in the Night, recently came out by Heather Webb. That is about Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner, and that's a good book to look at when you're looking at a true account of a historical figure that is also fictionalized. I mean, it's done well. When done well, it's really fun, but I definitely think that there is a lot of research that needs to go into it. So, but I like
Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, which I guess a lot of people will have read, which tells that, retells the life of Thomas Cromwell. And I mean, that's an interesting example. They're great novels. It's 3 novels in succession. And essentially has taken a historical character who was regarded as something of an historical villain, I think, certainly in sort of British historical accounts. And she has totally sort of reframed that character, which just shows you actually that history, whether we think history is truth or story, history is always how it's presented. It's who tells the history that makes what we believe to be the historical truth. So, as fiction writers, we can do a lot to sort of reimagine and recast history.
Well, I have to say I'm thrilled about this discussion, because this is why I started History Through Fiction, to publish historical novels. And I started out, from the academic side of things as a historian, and I wanted a way to share more history, to bring it to life, and that's when I decided to study fiction, and then I brought it all together to create History Through Fiction. And there's a balance there that we're always really striving to find that balance, and it's just so great to hear all of you in the craft talking about how you do that, and if and when you can. But let's move away for a second from historical figures. We have a question from Edie about characters and how long do they stay with you. And I know as fiction authors, you have to spend a lot of time developing your characters, getting to know your characters. Do they stay with you afterward?
Sure, definitely. Although I've recently realized that I've reached the point where now I've written enough books that I can't always remember all of them, which is actually like sort of a surreal feeling. So like right now I'm still very emotionally involved with Hannah Masuri. I think about her all the time. And I'm pretty emotionally involved still with the protagonist of my first novel, because I also did a follow-up book to that book. And so I've written about her twice. And she's, my first novel, The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, was a Salem story, and it's probably my most widely read novel. And so I still hear from people, and people kind of tangle me and Connie up together in their minds a little bit. And yet then there's some characters that I have to kind of remind myself that I wrote them. And at one time we were very emotionally involved, and they're like exes I haven't talked to in a while. Like I still wish them well. And like I'd see them on Facebook or something and be like, oh, look, they got married. They had a baby. I feel that way with like a couple of former characters of mine.
I can add that my main character, because he was someone whose life I followed, who inspired me, and he just came to life for me in such a way that I was going to give up the whole book early on, and I thought, I want to do this. And that was the very day I received the packet from the Veterans Administration. And they told me it would take months. It was there the day I decided I was going to give up. And the first thing I saw when I opened it was his application for a pension. And he said, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I need somebody to help me. And I thought, oh, okay. And I actually I figured out where his grave was, and I sent him flowers. So that's what he meant to me, and still does. So I wanted him to feel like a real person, right? I'm going to take care of you now. So he was very dear to me and still is. And Mary embodied a lot of the things that were involved. I lost my father 5 years into writing the book. So my female character was a way of grieving for my father in a way that if you read the book, you'll see. So I think there's a lot of emotion you put in with characters, and you don't just let that go. They stay with you. And one last quick, anecdote about the writing of it is that sometimes characters just lie there and you don't know what to do with them. And the mother of John, who had gotten very dogmatic in her religion, I didn't know what to do with her. She just seemed to be lying indoors. So I said, would you just get up and go out and do something? And that's what she actually does in the book. She goes on an adventure. She gets up and she goes and does something, and it changes her life. And it is a turning point in the book that I didn't expect. So I was grateful to her for doing that as well. So I think they come to life in these funny ways when you let them. But with John, it was a real person I was very touched by.
Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for joining me. Congratulations on your novels. I want to thank all of the people who attended. I also want to thank anyone who, this is a free event, but there were some people who donated, and that helps offset the cost of the Zoom platform. So I really appreciate that, and it helps us continue to do more of these events. Our next one is not until January 31st, and I haven't put up the links to that, but I will before the end of the month here. Before we go, though, I always ask our panelists one final question, and that is, why historical fiction? What is the value of turning this history into a story? Emily, if you could start off talking about the value of historical fiction.
Yeah, for me, it is that people and human nature is universal. And my favorite book, I read it in 7th grade for the first time, was Jane Eyre. And it opened my eyes to this idea that people have true feelings, emotions, and experiences throughout time. And I think that's just stuck with me. And I can't stop thinking about it, honestly. Anywhere I go, anytime I hear of something new, I just want to know more. And I want to know what their experience actually was like.
Katherine Vaz, what do you think?
I think it just happened that the character who came to life for me existed in the 19th century going into the 20th century. And it seemed also his life followed the arc of great inventiveness in America. And I kept trying to go away from it and kept going back to it. So I think it's sometimes characters choose us, and then you honor the era that where they exist, because a lot of my other short stories and novels are more contemporary, and the next book I'm working on is contemporary, and I hope short. So I think it's honoring the backdrop and the era where human souls and spirits come to life for you, and then you put them in the era where they exist.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, is honoring. Katherine Howe, what do you think?
In my darkest and most cynical moments, I worry that there is no value to it, and I'm just part of the bread and circuses that keep us all contented cogs in a system of capitalist oppression. But sometimes I remind myself that fiction is really our only opportunity to experiment with radical empathy. And there is very little that is more other or distant from us than people living in the distant past. And I think sometimes we can be fooled into thinking that they live in the same world that we do. But it is such a challenge to occupy the mental landscape and emotional and religious landscape of people living 300 and 400 years ago. And I feel like that exercise and the exercise of reading into those experiences can kind of help us question some of the assumptions that we all cling to in the present.
Very well said. Seems like it was almost, you were prepared for that one almost. Wait, I'm sure you've been writing for a long time. Sean, what do you think about the value of historical fiction?
I mean, I think, Katherine and Emily have expressed it so well. And, just to pick up on what they said, honoring and empathy, I think the difference between good historical fiction and, frankly, the less good is where, you've got to honor those lives of the people in the past. And the whole joy of fiction is that we can create that empathy, both empathy with the characters, but you can create an incredible empathy in the reader that relates to the stories. We are our past, we're our own past, but we're the past of all those who lived before us. And I think the failure to understand the past is largely explains the problems of the time we live in today, because so many, our leaders, have failed to learn the lessons of the past. And I think one of the reasons perhaps that they failed to learn the lessons is they didn't read enough historical fiction. They didn't create that empathy. They don't honor the lives of those who lived before us enough. So without wishing to over-aggrandize our task, I think we do have a responsibility, if we can, as writers of historical fiction, to create that empathy and understanding in our readers.
Definitely. Well, thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to everyone who attended. In addition to picking up these books from bookshop.org, I saw Katherine posted in the chat, go and check out these authors, their websites, follow their newsletters, post about their books, and let's share these stories and share these histories. So thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for organizing, Colin.
Thank you,
Thank
Colin.
you. Great to meet you.